Good evening and welcome to We the People, brought to you by the League of Women Voters of Minneapolis. My name is Joan Higinbotham and I'll be your host for this evening's program. In the past 50 years, women in our society have made tremendous strides in many different areas. We're going to talk about some of those things tonight. Also, sort of why haven't things gone even further? We're never satisfied with the status quo. And we have with us tonight two guests who have done research and writing on this topic, and I think you're going to find it very interesting. Our first guest is Lori Sturdevant, and Lori is a editorial writer and columnist for the Star Tribune, probably well known to many of our viewers. Thank you for being with us.
My pleasure.
And the second guest this evening is Debra Fitzgerald, and Debra is the director of the Center on Women and Public Policy at the Humphrey School at the University of Minnesota. Perfect to talk with Lori tonight. Now, the first reason why we invited Lori to come tonight was because she's just finished a book. Well, I guess it's not just finished, but it's just been published, Her Honor, about Rosalie Wahl, and Rosalie was the first woman justice of the Minnesota State Supreme Court. So I guess the first question, Lori, is for you, and that's why did you do the book?
I've always been fascinated by the women's movement. I was a kid reporter for the Star Tribune, for the old Minneapolis Tribune in the late 1970s, and among my first assignments was to cover the very meeting at which Rosalie Wahl's appointment to the Supreme Court was announced in June of 1977.
So 77, which is how many years ago?
Well, gosh.
Quite a few.
37 years ago, because that is quickly in my head. Yeah, it was a major breakthrough because Minnesota had only one sitting female district court judge at that time in Hennepin County. And she had arrived on the bench through election, not gubernatorial appointment. Governors simply had not been appointing women to the courts until that day in June when Rosalie was appointed, and that same day Rudy Perpich appointed two other women to the district court bench.
So that was 77.
Yeah, that's right.
And now, and you, Debra, are really involved in something that is interesting, that sort of follows along on what Rosalie's done. Can you talk about the Infinity Project?
Yeah, absolutely. The book does a great job of sort of pointing out how actually people had to organize to make sure that the Rosalie Wahl appointment happened. And so it wasn't something that just kind of happened. It was something that was built up to by a lot of people's involvement. And so the Infinity Project is a project that was started about 5 years ago by 4 Minnesota women in the legal academics as well as legal partners in the Twin Cities area, who were alarmed that we only had one woman, and only one woman had ever been appointed to the 8th Circuit Court of Appeals, so federal court. That sits right below the Supreme Court. It's the court of last resort for most Minnesotans, and the fact that there had been 61 judges appointed to that court and only one had ever been appointed.
Now, of course, I have to say that the one who was appointed was a former president of the League of Women Voters.
Yes, and a Minnesotan.
Yes, Diana Murphy.
Absolutely, and but since her appointment by Clinton in the 80s, we'd had 9 appointments to the bench, and none of them had been women. So clearly, we weren't rectifying this, this disparity without some kind of activism around it. And so this group got together and formed the Infinity Project to kind of do a 3-pronged approach, and really many of the things that the Infinity Project does were done to get the Rosalie Wahl appointment accomplished. So for example, the project raises awareness about the lack of and importance of women on the bench. It works with decision makers like governors and senators who have the power to make appointments to, again, hold them accountable for addressing the gender disparities on the bench. And then finally, it helps women who are interested or think they might want to step up to those kinds of roles to make that step, to demystify the processes, to let them know that they're going to be supported if they do step up. And so in those 3 ways, we're really working in the 8th Circuit. And we had some success last year with the appointment of Jane Kelly, the second woman to the 8th Circuit bench. And she actually, it was very interesting as well, was with Rosalie Wahl, that she is a federal public defender. So it was bringing another interesting, different kind of perspective to the bench as well.
And she's Iowan, right?
She's an Iowan.
Yes, that's right.
Well, now that is a really good point, is that the sad thing for me is that they thought that the men said that Rosalie was not qualified.
Well, that's right, because she had not come up the traditional track that had been the path that previous judicial high court appointments had followed. She'd not been a district court judge. She had not been a prosecutor. She had gone to law school at midlife and had been a public defender at the appellate level and had been a law school professor, establishing a clinical education program, the first criminal clinical education program at William Mitchell College of Law, her alma mater. So her path was unconventional to the court. But actually, that was one of the things that appealed to Governor Rudy Burbidge.
Of course, yes. Well, so it's interesting, though, because what she did was unique and really showed maybe more independence or thoughtfulness or whatever than...
Well, Burbidge liked to say that he was a champion of the underdog, and indeed, I think his record says he was. And the notion that she had been a public defender, helping the people who have some of the poorest opportunity to have their voices heard in the court system, people who are indigent and have already been convicted at the district court level, that spoke well of Rosalie to him. And the fact that she'd been working in the clinical realm at the law school, again, representing the lowliest of the defendants in the what was then municipal court system in St. Paul, that was something that appealed to Rudy Burbidge.
Well, you've had fair success with getting women to work on this project, but have you had, I mean, you're working on the federal bench.
We started out really focused on the 8th Circuit, but quickly realized that we had to kind of work the pipeline. And so actually we have sort of brought our work down to the state level. And some of the other states in the 8th Circuit are in much more dire straits than here in Minnesota. We actually are doing a pretty good job here in Minnesota and making pretty steady progress. In fact, in Hennepin County, we now 52% of the Hennepin County District Court judges are women.
Wow. So, well, and now I looked, and I don't know how many the total is, but there are 8 women right now, I think, on the Court of Appeals.
I think that's right.
And I don't know what the total number of judges is.
I want to say 19. Does that sound right to you?
Yeah, it's close to, it's like 42%.
So that's really good. Well, I suppose, and traditionally the pipeline always was, you become a district judge, or you become a municipal judge, a district judge, and then you're pushed up the ladder to the Supreme Court.
That was the traditional pipeline, and that was one of the reasons that when Rosalie was appointed in 1977, some of the men who were in line, they thought, for high court appointments were offended. She had to face a primary election just about 11 months after she was appointed to the high court, and she had to face one former DFL Attorney General and 2 sitting district court judges, one from St. Paul, one from Rochester, and they were tough opponents. Yes. All men, of course.
So now, just to review here, in Minnesota, you can run for election or you can be appointed, and then the next time an election comes around, if it's more than a year after you've been appointed, you have to run for election.
That's right, exactly.
So, in other words, Rosalie was unfortunately a month too
That's right.
soon.
She took office in the first part of October. Had she been appointed and able to take office just a few months earlier, she would have not had to run for election until 1980. But I suspect those male judges would have been gunning for in 1980 as well.
Yeah. Well, so now we're doing okay in Minnesota, but not great.
Well, I would say we're doing okay in Minnesota in our urban areas, and this is a really an important point to make, right? That we find that when we get outside of the metropolitan area, we still have some significant disparities. So when we look at the 8th District Court or the 6th District Court in Northeast Minnesota, where 18% of the judges are women. So we still have work to do in Minnesota, absolutely. Even though here in our urban areas we've done a pretty good job, we still have those disparities in rural parts of the state.
Well, what percentage of, say, the class at William Mitchell or the university is women now?
Oh, it's now more than half. But when Rosalie Wahl was a student at William Mitchell in 1962, out of a class of 75 students, she was one of 2 women, just 2. By 10 or 15 years later, it's already a big gain as that baby boomer generation moves into law school, the best educated generation America had seen to that point. And doors begin to open. And so already by the time Rosalie's daughter was in law school, and Rosalie was a professor in the 1970s at in the very same program from which Rosalie had graduated, already there are something like 15 or 20% female, and within just a few years after that, a third and then a half of the students at Minnesota's law schools are female.
But the big but is, what happens to those women when they graduate from law school? Can the Infinity Project talk a little
we
bit?
know that I know one of the things that Lori's book does a great job is laying out the importance of the Gender Bias Task Force, and some of the work that's continued from that work which was initiated during that period of time is what's called the SAGE report, which is continuing to look at bias in the legal profession. And we find that still half of both men and women are reporting that they see gender bias, and it also looks at other forms of bias, and I think that's a positive movement in the work that's been building. And also I think in Lori's book she does a nice job of talking about how the Gender Fairness Task Force set the stage for a race bias task force. And since that time, they've kind of broadened it out to look at LGBT bias, to really look at bias across the different types of identities within the legal system. And unfortunately, that SAGE report shows that there's still 50% of men and women reporting that within the legal profession at various levels, whether it's the courts or it's in law firms, that there's still gender bias. And those numbers actually rose from the previous report 3 years earlier.
That's what I wondered about, yeah.
We're continuing to see problems.
The last time I saw Rosalie was at a panel discussion at her alma mater, William Mitchell. She was in the audience as some distinguished female jurists, several judges, several distinguished lawyers, talked about the status of women in the profession. Not so much in the courts, but in the profession as a whole. And among the comments were that law is a good profession for a single woman who has no children, or a good profession for a woman who's the prime breadwinner in her household and whose spouse, whose husband, is at home minding the store. But it's still not a career that has adjusted well to the reality of modern life, which is the two-earner household for most people who are trying to make adult life work. And that is, I think, not just true of the law. It's true of many fields and many occupations. We have not made work for enough people in this society, and I think that's the major unfinished business of the women's movement of the 20th century.
So it's not just the law, it's medicine.
And frankly, low-income workers have it even tougher in many ways, because they don't have some of the flexibility, and they're also they have no control over their schedules, they have no sick leave. So while it is definitely true of our professions, whether it's the law or medicine, those kinds of fields, it's doubly true, I think, for low-income women in our state and in our country.
Well, what about the state of Minnesota? We just passed the Women's Economic Security Act.
I think that was just a breakthrough moment. We haven't had a major comprehensive piece of legislation that tried to address the situation of women at work like this for at least 20 years. Debra was involved in lobbying for that piece of legislation. I helped write it for the Star Tribune, something that I see as a breakthrough.
Well, what were it seems, of course, to me that it's something that we just have to pass. First of all, exactly what was it, and why were people opposed to it?
Well, I think that, as Lori was saying, we are talking about trying to change the way our labor force kind of works. And so obviously that's a big change, to really confront the fact that we have this sort of dual earner kind of lifestyle where everybody's working and that our workplaces haven't really adapted. So I think our biggest opposition really came from the business communities, which were saying, you're going to require us to make some changes. And we were...
Now, what were the changes that they wanted to
make?
So
we did some things to kind of address the increased participation of women in the workforce, mothers in the workforce in particular, and pregnant women, nursing mothers. So we did some work to require some minor accommodations to keep pregnant women and nursing mothers in the workforce. We extended some of our unpaid leave options in the state of Minnesota to make that more available to both men and women, and to make it available to pregnant women. That was not available to pregnant women in the state of Minnesota prior to that. And then, in general, the law, we also tried to address the issue of what I like to call the motherhood penalty, which is a continuing discrimination. I think that the face of gender discrimination in our workplaces now really is around motherhood or fatherhood and caregiving, not necessarily just being a woman. As Lori said, in the legal profession, it's fine if you're a single woman, but once you have children, then you run up against extra barriers. And so the law created a new protected class in our Human Rights Act for parents, basically the added familial status. We hope to go a little bit further to involve caregivers of elders, which is another huge area, but we were able to get the familial status protections in the Human Rights Act, so this will make sure that employers cannot discriminate against mothers and fathers in the workforce.
Well, as you were writing about this for the paper, what did you find? Was the public more accepting of this than the legislature was, or I mean, it seems to me that it's just kind of fairness.
I have to tell you, I was shocked at some of the testimony at the legislature on this bill.
Really?
I am old enough to have been able to stay with my profession, stay with my Star Tribune job when I had my children, and had maternity leave provided for in my contract. That was relatively new, I will say, when I got to the newspaper in the 70s. It was something that had, and I knew people at the office who just a few years before me had to quit work when they were pregnant and then would find a way back into the newsroom. But I thought those days had ended, that when women were pregnant, they were forced out of their jobs. Not so. We had testimony at the legislature from women in several professions who felt pushed by their employers. Oh, honey, if it's too hard for you to stand, maybe you should just quit your job. When she would ask for an accommodation like being able to sit on a high stool rather than stand through an 8-hour day. That kind of thing, those kinds of simple adjustments, employers apparently have been unwilling to make. Those kinds of discriminatory moves are outlawed by this new piece of legislation. Reasonable accommodations for pregnant women and nursing mothers will now need to be made.
Now, this must have been a coalition. I mean, I think we think back to the book. Were there a lot of women's groups that worked on this?
Yeah, absolutely. And then we branched out beyond women's groups. So we had labor unions, we had people who take action, and others who've been working with low-income communities. So we really did kind of branch out beyond the women's movement, and which is appropriate, frankly, because the act not only helps women, of course, but it helps families, and it does help men as well. And we did have pieces of the act that were designed to address, for example, we found that fathers who take on major caregiving responsibilities can also be discriminated against at work. And if we don't protect them, if they can't take on those additional responsibilities, that remains women's job. And so anyway, so we had a very broad-based coalition of organizations that came together to work on passage.
Well, I was going to say the same thing happened with Rosalie, and you said that many times that she talked about how it was if it weren't for the women.
She always said that it was the women that brought her to that position of being able to be on the court. And she had such a strong sense. She was the only woman on the court for her first 5 years of serving there. At one point she was angry with that situation. There had been 3 men appointed after she was appointed, but she said, "We will not give 1 inch to despair." She was willing herself and the people around her to be optimistic that there would indeed be another breakthrough moment, and it came in 1982 with the second woman being appointed by Governor Al Quie after he had first appointed those 3 men.
But that one woman was a single person and had no family, and she was an older lady too. I mean, she was...
That's right, and that was more the pattern of those few women who were in a position to be judges. Rosalie herself had been divorced, and I think she was in her early 50s when she was appointed to the court. So she was someone who was able to put family caregiving responsibilities to the side at that point in her life. But yes, she felt very strongly that the women's movement had brought her to that position, had then seen her through the election in 1978, and then she felt an obligation to help other younger women follow suit. So she became a very strong voice for that kind of thing.
And it seemed to me, though, that the success that they had getting Rosalie on the court really kind of empowered them to do other things too. I mean, that was not their only victory.
Well, Rosalie would say it was a yeasty time. It was a time when there were lots of breakthroughs in lots of places, and my book describes what was happening in the realm of government and politics in Minnesota. But there could be a whole other books written about what was happening in academics, what was happening with athletics. The explosion of girls' sports after Title IX happens during the same period, and each profession was seeing some change as a result of this broad societal women's movement. This was a mass movement. And to me, it speaks of the power of average citizens to come together and make change.
Just people who probably had just had enough, as they say, and were ready to move on. And it's interesting, though, that the things that people, I mean, I guess, in a way, I'm disappointed that we haven't moved further. I mean, somebody asking for a stool when they're pregnant doesn't seem like it's a huge accommodation.
No, things, I think, come in generational waves. Rosalie's generation, these were the mothers of the baby boomers. They had experienced, many of them, a little bit of freedom during World War II when the men were off in the military. Rosalie was one of the campus leaders at the University of Kansas when she was a student, when the campus was devoid of men. They tasted a little bit of the opportunities that might have been available in a non-traditional way. But then the men came home, they had lots of babies.
That's right.
And then it came time to educate those babies, and they needed income. They needed more income than traditional roles were providing. They had the education and the itch and the drive to succeed. They were a long living generation, plenty of energy still at age 45 and 50 to do something else. That was the movement, that the group, the cohort, that led what we call the second wave women's movement. The baby boomers, we are their kids. We are now nearing our retirement, and our children, the millennials, are the next big generation coming into the workforce. They are as numerous as the baby boomers themselves were. They are well educated, and I think they're the next big force for change.
Now, when you were doing your work, Debra, on this legislation, but other stuff that you've done in general, do you find, I mean, I've heard women say, I am not a feminist. Millennials, I am not a feminist.
Yeah, well,
so what's the story?
I think one of the things that was really, really refreshing about working on the Women's Economic Security Act, however, was that we just had an incredible outpouring of younger women who, many of whom were willing to come and testify, who made their own little handmade buttons and carried them around and lobbied legislators. And I think that was extremely powerful, that younger women were really stepping up to say, this affects me. And, you know, I think that going to the point of, you know, that we're at a kind of a breaking point, I think, in terms of thinking about as our society has evolved and everybody is working now and trying to manage both caregiving and working, and that we've moved forward in terms of men sort of owning their share of caregiving in our society, that we really are at a point where something has to change. And so I think that we're hopeful that the Women's Economic Security Act is just a part at the beginning of that kind of breaking free of, you know, moving to a new way of thinking about work and caregiving and the society and the lives that we live now today, as opposed to that situation where we had somebody at home taking care of all of the caregiving needs in our society and somebody in the workforce. And we're just at a very different place now, and our institutions just have to change. And I think both men and women, younger men and women, while they may not own the term feminism, I think we really are, you know, I think there's a recognition that the workplace isn't working for anybody.
So it's more equity for everybody.
Yeah, I think it's been most acute for women, but I think that, you know, we really are seeing the demand coming from all sides.
It's about asking, how is our society going to get its work done? As adults, we have responsibility for the young, for the old, and for ourselves. How are we going to divide our time, our energies, our resources, so that we can make sure that everyone is cared for, so we can have a decent and humane society? That's what's really being asked here.
And that isn't necessarily feminism. That's equality.
No, but it does seem that the energy, the push for change, is coming from the female side.
You think so?
That's what I'm told.
Yeah, no, I think that's true. I mean, I think obviously, you know, when we look at things like the gender wage gap, which is, you know, I think a really great global measure of the, you know, inequities that still
80 cents versus
$80
$1.
80 cents, yeah, 80 cents
but
on
I think
$1.
It was 69 cents
it
when I first started working on the issue.
It has moved, but it has sort of a plateaued, like
Another
we were
plateau.
talking about, another plateau. And so I think that's the alarming thing. I think a lot of the statistics show that, you know, I think people assume that we would continue to make progress on these
I guess
matters.
that's what's sort of surprising to me is, I mean, as I said in the opening, it's been 50 years, really, since Title IX and well, Rosalie, not quite 50 years, but a lot of these things change. But yet now it seems like, are we really? You think it's the next breakthrough?
Well, I do. I think that these things come in generational waves. I think we've had kind of a plateau in Minnesota. The apex of the 20th century women's movement happened when we had a majority, female majority on the state state Supreme Court,
Right.
1991 to
That's what I checked.
1994.
Yes.
The first ever in Minnesota history and the first in the country. Never, no other state has yet reached that
And we had
achievement.
4 out of 7.
4 out of 7. Rosalie's retirement breaks that pattern. But I think that's just a marker of what became kind of a lull in the women's movement. But there's an opportunity now for that 20 years after her retirement for that energy to build
Now,
again.
do you see the same thing? I mean, you've done all this research, so you probably, Deb, have a sort of a feel for...
What we've seen so far is the plateau, and but I think that you know, again, we're hopeful that we are reaching a tipping point generationally, and so I think that is definitely true in the data, and we have reached kind of a state where it's just not workable. The current kind of setup is not workable. The institutions are, you know, going to have to change, and I think we're reaching a point where there might be some you know, some of that equilibrium is broken up by acts like the Women's Economic Security Act that really dislodge some of the thinking that things are, you know, continuing to improve when they're not, and so I think, yeah, I'm hopeful.
The state that figures this out is going to have an economic advantage. It's going to be a talent magnet, and it's going to solve some of the problems, especially if we can address the caregiver issue, which was not passed as part of the Economic Security Act, proposed but was not accepted
Now, what
in the
does
end.
it mean, caregiver?
It means that there would be an explicit ban against employment discrimination on the basis of someone being a caregiver for a vulnerable adult, either a parent or some other relative often. We need to keep people who are vulnerable and frail out of institutions, which is expensive for taxpayers as well as for families. We need to keep people of the baby boomer generation in the workforce as long as possible to keep our retirement cost burden down. We need, for an economic basis, to make this stage of life work better for people so that families can manage those situations themselves rather than fall back on taxpayer support. The business community wants lower taxes. This is one strategy, to keep taxes low.
Now, is it true that women, both women and men, are working less than full time? I mean, is that something that your research has shown too? I mean, because they've got all these other responsibilities.
No, I think that's the thing, that's the rub. I mean, actually, working hours are up in the United States
more.
And in Minnesota.
Especially
among
older people, among those the cohort 55 and up, the hours working is actually increasing.
And you know, among mothers, Minnesota has among the highest workforce participation rates in the country, and it's increased the most among women with children under 6. So it's 80% of those women here in the state of Minnesota work compared to 70% nationally.
Well, you can see from this discussion that we've had that things certainly have changed a lot in the last 50 years, and maybe we are at the peak of something really exciting happening in the next 50 years. We'll just have to wait and see, but I hope you've enjoyed hearing tonight about some of the pioneers in the movement and what's ahead. Thanks to our guests, Lori Sturdevant and Deb Fitzpatrick, and thanks to you for tuning in to We the People. This is Joan Higinbotham for the League of Women Voters of Minneapolis saying, tune in again. Good night.